The production history of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends is certainly interesting, with major changes happening from season to season. Welcome to the series on my channel where we dive into the production history and technical aspects of this little blue tank engine's life. Today we will be diving into the whole Clearwater Features era, covering the periscope lens, series 1 and 2, and of course, TUGS. So to kick things off, let's look into how the camera for Thomas the Tank Engine was created. Series 1 began filming in late 1983. Britt Allcroft had hired a company called Clearwater Entertainment to create and film the model work, with David Mitton becoming director. Mitton was a visionary who loved creating work that popped off the screen. He had lots of experience working with miniatures and was the right man for the job. However, when you watch Series 1, you begin to notice it feels limited. I'm not talking about the set design or the model work, I'm referring to the camera work. You see, for Series 1, the camera almost always sat on the track. This was due to a lack of budget for a proper rig. An old tale that used to go around is that the grass seen in Series 1 is just flour with food colouring added, as this was a great cheap alternative. For a majority of the first series, a standard 35mm camera would be placed on a tripod at the edge of the set, or even sometimes just directly flat on the set, after moving track and set dressing aside. Then, a zoom lens was used to allow the camera to appear closer to the models where applicable. Often, to achieve shots looking up at the engines, as seen in Thomas and Gordon, the engine models would be propped above the tracks, with the tripod at its lowest height. Any other shots were always at a slightly higher vantage point than compared to the later series. This style of shot does not carry over into the later series. This is why Series 1 doesn't have many exciting moving shots, and the ones that you do see are simply a combination of the tripod and zoom lens being utilised creatively. Angles were much more difficult to achieve in this era of Thomas, and it's why Series 1 really stands out. Sure, the later seasons really did spice up the production, but Series 1 has this calm charm that we all can't help but love. Clearwater Features had begun heavy work on their rigging system during the latter half of the production on the first series. The final product was named the Clearwater Periscope Lens System. They were designed by David Mitton and Terence Perman. The specialist cameras were built in the United States, with the lenses being created in Japan. Only 2 of these systems were ever created. The interesting thing is that this system was used in Series 1, but from what I can tell through behind the scenes pictures, it was used scarcely. I think this is because they were still developing and getting used to the system, and with short production time, it was easier to lay the camera on the table. It was only when Series 2 started production that the periscope system became a permanent setup for the show. Even in Series 2 you can see the team was slightly restricted with shots, and it's only once TUGS happened, David Mitton and his team realised its full potential.
Using this lens, which my cameraman and I designed up together, it can track with the engine, along the engine tracks as well, alongside it, with it, fly over bridges and track with it. It can do anything.
Now you may be asking what a periscope lens system is. Well, let me walk you through it. It's almost identical to the periscope lens found on a submarine, as it allows you to see from a vantage point that the human eye, or in this case a camera lens, cannot naturally reach. The camera is fastened to a series of tracks that are rigged just above the set. This allows it to move relatively freely and smoothly, like an upside down dolly. The camera and its accompanying lens are attached high above to the start of the periscope system, which uses layers of glass internally to reflect the imagery down on the set and send it to the 35mm camera. With the periscope curving out at the bottom, it allows the camera to be at a ground level with its subjects. Tailored with a wide-angle lens that was looking up just inches from the ground. This vantage rig allows the engines to look bigger than they actually are. And there you have it. Now you can understand why Series 1 feels a little different to the rest of the show. It is the only series to feature in-camera zooms, used most notably in the opening shot of Trouble in the Shed, as opposed to the later usage of tracking shots with the periscope system. To this day, both systems still exist. One is currently based in Canada, as Robert D. Cardona took it to be modified for his Sony BVP-7 for Viador tugboat, after TUGS had ended, and the other continued to work on the show up until it switched to CGI and remains in Mattel's property.
It's very special in as much as it gets down to what I call children's level. We're shooting everything down as though they're down there with little toys and they're down at that level, but it's also what I call proper camera level.
That's good there.
The custom-built lens has feather-sensitive controls, allowing focus from infinity down to 1 inch.
The system was completely unique and at the time was revolutionary for film in miniatures. It truly shows the experts behind Clearwater Features and how they were always meant to be the team behind the job. Now that we know how the periscope lens system came to be, let's take a deeper dive into the production history of Series 1. The current show we all know and love could have been a much different adaptation of the Reverend W. Awdry's Railway Series books. By 1978, there had already been a failed BBC special that showcased the episode The Sad Story of Henry, which resulted in a disastrous outcome due to being filmed live, and Awdry refused to trust the BBC ever again. There was also a planned Andrew Lloyd Webber musical series about these talking trains, but nothing other than a pilot was created. It wasn't until 1979, when Britt Allcroft was filming a documentary about steam engines in the UK, that she met the Reverend Awdry. She grew fascinated with the books and their characters, and strived to gain TV rights through Awdry's publishers.
What first attracted me to the stories were and still are the characters, the adventures, the situations they get into. And this is what made me want to bring them to life on the screen, with all the things that a multi-dimensional world can do.
It was then that Britt and her husband formed the Britt Allcroft Company. It then took a couple of years before Britt Allcroft did anything else. During this time, she remortgaged her house and saved money to be able to produce her adaptation of the Railway series. Britt Allcroft did need a pilot film to sell the show to channels in the UK. She needed a director to help bring her vision to life, and after seeing a yogurt advert directed by David Mitton, she decided to meet with him. Britt mentioned the creation of a pilot to David, and they both agreed live-action models would be the way forward, creating a partnership between her company and David Mitton's company, Clearwater Features. Somewhere down the line here, it was decided the show would be named Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. After ITV showed interest in Britt's production, it was soon realised very quickly that this was becoming a reality, and concept art was created by Robert Gold-Golliers. A script was written to meet the 5-minute time slot, and a list of characters and scales was also made so the model crew knew what to make for the pilot. Gauge 1 models of Thomas and Gordon were made especially for this pilot. The episode filmed for the pilot was Down the Mine, and it was stressed by Britt Allcroft and David Mitton that this would be a lower quality version of the show. The pilot went into production in March 1983 and took 3 weeks to film. It was filmed at Clearwater's Battersea studio on 35mm film. In 2025, for the 80th anniversary of the Railway series, the pilot was released to the public on the Thomas and Friends YouTube channel. This was a new 2025 edit, which was restored and rescanned in Ultra HD by Silver Salt Restoration. Some shots were repurposed from the final episode to make sure the story was told in its entirety. This isn't how it would have been shown in 1983. I can only assume this is due to the fact that these film reels are missing. However, a production image has leaked and gives us an idea of what this set would have looked like in the pilot. Mike O'Donnell returned to rescore this 2025 edit due to the fact that the original audio track was also missing. It's wonderful to finally be able to see the pilot in all its glory, and it's certainly interesting to see how different it looked. The way shots are composed are much different to how Series 1 ended up looking. I can only assume this was due to the use of a different lens. Something I got completely wrong in my original video was about who narrated the pilot. It turns out Ringo Starr did indeed also narrate the pilot episode, and in the 2025 edit we hear this dialogue, along with some of his Series 1 narration spliced in for where it is missing. This recording of his narration took place in March of 1983. I find this interesting as a lot of crew members in interviews claim Ringo never narrated the pilot. However, it was so long ago that it's understandable that they forgot. What we know from the pilot is that the crew found it a great learning curve for the rest of the show. The pilot was finally test screened in April 1983 with a positive response, and the series was greenlit by ITV. The next stages were to complete all major models in June, whilst the rest of the crew worked on storyboards and cross-plotting. Finalisation on scripts needed to be sorted by this stage too, so that Ringo Starr could return to record all 26 episodes.
Did it take you ages to actually record it, or was it one of those things you just dashed in?
No, it took about 8 days. We used to do about 4 or 5 a day, and then we had to redo 4 of them because the tone of your voice in the morning to, you know, when you've got rolling changes.
I know just what you mean.
Hello, kiddies, it's Uncle Rich here. And so we did 4 again, so it took about 8 days.
It took Ringo just over a week to record all his narration for the show, including retakes.
And I'd never read the books as a child. I was probably one of the few children who was deprived of them. And I'm more of a Beano man. And I read the books and I thought they were fabulous. You know, I thought they were really good books. And also the drawings in the book, the style of them I loved. And she convinced me that, you know, they were going to be animated in that style. You know, they weren't going to make them cheap looking. So I thought it'd be a nice thing for me to do, really.
Mm-hmm. And are you pleased with the end product?
I'm real pleased with the end product.
At the same time, the recently chosen composers Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell were recording the music for the show. It is believed that during this time, Ringo Starr walked into the 2 recording and ended up playing the bell for Toby's theme. I always find it interesting that this was done in pre-production, as narration, without lip sync, and especially music, would usually be done in post-production to match up with the edits of episodes. In August 1983, the final scripts with correct notes for visuals were finalised. A general production meeting was held at this time, final checks were put into place, and finally, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was ready to begin production. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends went into production in September 1983 with a total of 26 episodes needed to be filmed. Setup days and film tests were done before the crucial day of the 12th of September, being the first date to begin filming. All episodes were based around the stories from the Railway series with the exception of one, Thomas's Christmas Party. Due to the agreement for the show at the time, all stories had to be based on a book, so Audrey had to rush out a story to match this new Christmas themed episode. New models were made for Thomas and Gordon, along with models created for the rest of the cast. It was decided the show would remain in the same scale as the pilot. It is believed the budget to make and film all 26 episodes cost somewhere around £500,000, which with today's inflation is about £1.5 million. During filming, an Apple Macintosh computer was present, and a log was made so the crew knew which shots had been filmed for each set. This was then saved onto a floppy disk. It is believed production didn't overshoot due to wrapping in March 1984, which is what Britt Allcroft had originally planned for, a whole year after production began on the pilot. Post-production was quite unique for the show, that being editing began whilst the series was still in production. This was most likely sourcing the right takes from the rushes so they would be ready to be compiled together when production wrapped. All episodes had to be completed by June 1984, which was quite a tight timescale. During this time, pickup shots were filmed and some sound effects were specially recorded for the series, with a trip to the Talyllyn Railway taking place. It is believed that these sound effects were only used in the first series. To help promote the show, Ringo Starr's name and face was plastered in all types of media. Being an ex-Beatle, having him involved with the show was a great selling point. Once the episodes were all complete, Britt could only sit and wait to see if her production was a success. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends premiered on the 9th of October 1984, with Wilbur Awdry and Ringo Starr appearing on breakfast television for ITV to help promote it.
And of course we have the Reverend Audrey with us as well, who's the creator of this new Thomas the Tank Engine series, which, when does it actually go out, Ringo?
It goes out at 12 this afternoon. I hope all your mums will get your kids around the telly and watch it.
And you're doing
And
narration for it.
I do the narration and the Reverend wrote it.
Wonderful.
And Clearwater made it all visible.
What do you make of him? Do you think he's done a good job?
Well, I think Ringo's done an excellent job.
Your words in my mouth, we could go anywhere.
The first series of the show aired between October 1984 to January 1985, with great success. The show was doing so well it got regular reruns.
Voiced by Ringo Starr, the TV series premiered in 1984, featuring model trains with human-like expressions. It proved a hit with adults and children alike.
I think it's because the engines experience all the same kind of emotions: happiness, sadness, disappointment, making up with friends and so on, that little children experience in their own lives when they're growing up.
It was very clear the series was here to stay, and plans for a second series began development. So let's see how the crew went about working on a second series with the knowledge they already had. Here is Series 2. After the success of the first series, it was clear that a second series would go into development. It looks like a short break happened before pre-production began, but it seemed pretty fluid that the second series would try to release as quickly as possible. ITV had commissioned a second series due to the first success. The plan was to film another 26 episodes for the show, but the initial episode list changed drastically to the final product. At this stage, Britt Allcroft and David Mitton still had to adapt episodes based on Railway series stories or Audrey written. So the plan was to continue where they left off and look at filming some in-between stories which they had missed due to budget. The original list of episodes was very similar, with some exceptions, this being Gordon Goes Foreign, Percy's Promise and Double Header. All three stories were originally considered for Series 2, but were dropped. Gordon Goes Foreign even had some rough plans of using Henry's model with added smoke deflectors for the character of the big city engine. This is back during a time where they wouldn't make engines just for one episode, they'd reuse old assets. These episodes were all cut for one reason, and that was due to the team realising there was a strong lack of Thomas-based episodes. At this time, Wilbur Awdry hadn't written a story in quite some time, with the exception of Thomas's Christmas Party. However, his son Christopher had decided to continue the books after a failed murder mystery series. So, Christopher Awdry was commissioned to write a new book based around Thomas, which was titled More About Thomas the Tank Engine. The episodes Thomas, Percy and the Coal, The Runaway and Better Late Than Never were then chosen to be adapted for the series, but we'll talk a bit more about Better Late Than Never later on. The episode Thomas and Trevor was based on an annual story by Christopher Awdry, and he also wrote Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree, which would be the Christmas themed episode for this series. Unfortunately for this season, in comparison to Series 1, we don't have access to the production packet that allowed me to have the correct months for when each aspect of production was happening, so a few things might be jumbled up in time with these next few points. Many new characters were to be added to this season, so new models had to be created. The budget was higher for this series, but it certainly wasn't as high as it would later become. Also due to budget, it was decided that the two characters Boko and Daisy would share the same chassis and face casts. This was due to both of them never appearing in an episode together, and it stayed that way for the rest of the model series. The original cast also saw some cosmetic changes, with updated faces. Ringo Starr also returned to reprise his role as the narrator, with Robert D. Cardona remaining as producer and David Mitton as director. Clearwater Features at some point decided to leave their Battersea studio and move base to Shepperton Studios. This would become Thomas the Tank Engine's home studio for the rest of its live-action life. For this celebration, a model was made for the Clearwater studio, showcasing their famous logo and Thomas. This was later placed then on the front of their studio space. Robert Gold-Galliers returned to do some fantastic concept art. A lot of new locations would appear in this series, and some of the concept art really shows how massive they envisioned some of these sets to be. Scripts were also then written and finalised during this stage. I can only assume Ringo's dialogue and music would have been recorded once again during pre-production. Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell returned but had a new instrument to play with this year, that being the Sequential Circuit's Prophet 2000. This is what allowed the series to have those triumphant type themes like they used for Harold's. The plan for Season 2 was to try and shoot at a similar timescale to Season 1. It was decided production would begin in September of 1985, but things weren't going to go as smoothly as its first season. In September 1985, Season 2 began production at Shepperton Studios. It seemed initially things were running fine, but as most of you probably know, there was a slight hiccup that caused some issues. You see, Season 2 was the introduction of Donald and Douglas. The plan was to adapt 3 out of 4 of their stories from the book. Hello Twins was quite a short and dialogue-heavy story, so it was decided their introduction would happen during the story The Missing Coach. Most of this story was filmed, as you can see from these slides, but during the final shots of the episode, Britt Allcroft showed up on set and seemed concerned. She felt The Missing Coach would be too confusing for younger viewers, and it was decided during filming the episode should be scrapped. This is why Donald and Douglas's introduction in the episode Break Van was so abrupt. They had to cram their introduction into that episode. With the removal of this episode, it left the team with a problem. There would only be 25 episodes in the season, but due to their commission, they had to supply 26. So, another episode had to be written and filmed last minute. It is unknown which episode replaced The Missing Coach. Some people think it was Thomas and Trevor due to being based on an annual story, whilst others believe it could be The Runaway. However, I do believe it was better late than never, and this is due to it replacing not only the 15th episode of the series, but due to its light set design and use of stock footage from Series 1. Not to mention, it is also believed the Elsbridge set was the last to be filmed on due to this picture of the whole crew on it. Ringo Starr would have had to come back into the studio to record lines. So maybe the answer to finding out which was the new episode is by listening to how Ringo sounds. Either way though, there is no 100% confirmation, and we may never know. Due to this issue, production might have slightly gone over schedule, and Season 2 wrapped production in June 1986. Due to not having a production packet like Series 1, there is no real timescale of how production went for Series 2. Once again, the show would have been edited during production, and new sound effects were made, but it is unknown where they came from. I can only assume pickup shots were also done during this time. Ringo Starr once again did promotion with the models to highlight he was still a part of the show, and these were used for all types of media. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends Series 2 premiered on the 24th of September 1986, with once again a huge success. The second series proved just to be as popular as the first. However, at this time, there were no plans for a third. David Mitton and Robert Cardona decided it was time for Clearwater Features to work on something different for a bit, and initial plans would begin development after Series 2 aired. Britt Allcroft decided she wanted to bring Thomas the Tank Engine to international markets, with her main objective allowing Thomas to have a home in the USA. The two teams decided to split ways, and at the time it was unknown when or if they would ever work together again. In the meantime, David Mitton and Robert D. Cardona began developing what they believed to be their magnum opus for Clearwater Features. This was the concept of TUGS, and ultimately resulted in the End of Clearwater Features. So let's take a look into the production of TUGS. After the success of the first 2 seasons of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, producer Robert D. Cardona and director David Mitton decided to depart from Britt Allcroft in 1986 and create their own children's TV show aimed at a slightly older audience. Meaning Thomas the Tank Engine would remain in hiatus for the foreseeable future. This wasn't a problem for Britt Allcroft, as she wanted to expand Thomas's reach globally, especially in the United States, and she began forming the idea of Shining Time Station, but we'll talk more about that in the near future. In its day, TUGS didn't have the cult following like it does today, but that doesn't mean the crew didn't put 100% into making this a successful show. During some stage of Thomas's second season, David Mitton and Robert Cardona began brainstorming their new creation. Their idea was to create a show set in a United States harbour in the early 1920s, focusing on the working industrial power of a fleet of tugboats. TUGS was going to have to be produced through Mitton and Cardona's own money, and so they created the company TUGS Limited. This company, along with Clearwater Features, would supply most of the money for the show's production. Unlike Thomas, they would be able to have a lot more creative freedom as they didn't have to follow any source material. The initial plan was for each episode to be 30 minutes long, which was incredibly longer than Thomas had or ever would be. Scripts and concept art began development to follow this runtime. Some of the original scripts depict there was going to be a narrator voicing all the characters. This was later changed to a full voice cast. A few concept ideas of how the boats would look were designed. A large portion of the crew from Thomas the Tank Engine agreed to work on TUGS, as it was another job with a similar team. Mitton and Cardona knew they wanted to have moving eye mechanisms much like Thomas, but also wanted to add rotating heads to give more expression.
Well, it's all radio controlled. As you can see, we've got an 8-channel transmitter here, and there's servos inside which operate the eyes and the face. And some of the tugs have got other additions like paddle wheels which turn, and sternways and things like that. So that it's all controlled by here.
Some concept ideas show the faces were initially going to be flat rather than curved. It is believed Britt Allcroft was not pleased by the concepts and news, as she felt this was too similar to Thomas the Tank Engine. She was worried TUGS' success would overpower Thomas's, resulting in Britt Allcroft filing a lawsuit against Mitton and Cardona. This would be the first time Britt and David would have a proper disagreement, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Britt ultimately lost the lawsuit due to her trademark being for vehicles with grey faces, whilst the TUGS faces were flesh coloured. However, this would emphasise the reason the TUGS faces became curved and had square eyes rather than using round beads to highlight the differences. I will make note that it is questioned whether the lawsuit actually happened, but I mentioned it as there is some strong evidence backing up the claims. Either way, the results ultimately remain the same. And so TUGS continued its pre-production journey, and the company, TVS, a branch of ITV, agreed to join Clearwater Features in helping produce TUGS. This now meant TUGS had some extra funding. It was decided early on that TUGS would not be radio controlled. This was due to David Mitton feeling RC boats looked too toy-like and bounced around too much, resulting in the TUGS being designed that they actually couldn't float on water. So, special trolley chassis were made for the TUGS to balance on.
Tugs actually move quite gently. I mean, they do rock from side to side, but usually they're as solid as a rock. They go up and down a little, but they're big, heavy boats. So on the way we're shooting it, if we stick it on a trolley, it actually looks quite realistic.
Initially, these were meant to be remote controlled, but due to the TUGS' weight, cables were mounted at the bottom, which would be pulled by crew members to give the illusion the boats had more weight and would cut through water naturally. Many characters had to be made for the series, and the models didn't come cheap. Each tug cost around £8,000 to complete, and in today's money, that is over £17,000. A voice cast was also assembled during this time, and over the course of pre-production and production, their lines were recorded. It was also agreed that Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell would also compose the music. They used the Prophet 2000 once again, but also a Roland Jupiter 6 synthesizer and a Yamaha RX5 drum machine. They also, for the first time in this series, used live recorded instruments, which included piano, bass guitar, and saxophone, which brought together that classic theme. A few variations of this theme song were also made, with Mike O'Donnell's son doing the original narration for the theme song. This was later switched to the character Captain Star. The series wasn't coming cheap, and to add to costs, the set also had to be considered. The plan was to once again film at Shepperton Studios. It had proved a useful space during the filming of Thomas the Tank Engine's second season, and the crew believed they could utilise the space to its full potential. A gigantic tank was built and filled with water. It was decided blue food colouring would be added to hide the mechanisms and cables at the bottom of the set. A filter was also added to keep the water clean. The tank measured at 45 feet by 25 feet, with a depth of 14 inches. This was such a huge scale and really allowed a whole harbour to be made.
This is in fact the miniature set for the TV series TUGS. The whole thing takes place in a tank.
Soon, everything was nearing completion, and it was almost time to start production. However, this wasn't going to be a plain sailing ride that David Mitton had envisioned. Filming for TUGS began in 1987 at Shepperton Studios, and huge wooden standees of 10 cents and zip stood at the entrance of Clearwater's stage, rather than their logo. It is unknown what month or date production began, unfortunately. The plan was to film 13 30-minute episodes.
Well, we've got now down to a 15-day turnaround. That's not allowing for the next episode to come on board. Also, it's gentle on sets.
The episodes were once again filmed via the Clearwater periscope lens system, which had been used during season 2 of Thomas. This is the production where the crew were able to discover the full potential of the system due to the massive sets. 2 people were required to operate the tugs, one moving the boats and the other controlling the head and eyes. Unlike Thomas, the tugs did not have smoke units built into them. Instead, smoke was produced via a smoke machine and pumped by an air compressor through a tube, which was connected to the models with a down-weighted garden hose to remain at the bottom of the tank.
We've got a smoke machine, which is piped up.
How long is the tube then that the smoke comes down?
About 15 feet. We can lengthen them, shorten them to suit. We put weights around them so they don't float around in the tank. So when it's actually in there, you don't see where the smoke comes from at all. It just comes out of the tug.
Episodes began filming on the big city port set, as this was where most of the stories took place. Unlike Thomas, they didn't have to assemble each asset of a location, as the whole location was already built. Whilst filming the episode Jinxed, ITV decided that the runtime of 30 minutes was too long for a child's attention span, and the decision was made to reduce episode runtimes down to 20 minutes. This didn't cause any problems, as only a small amount of filming had been done up until this point. So, scripts were readjusted to fit the 20-minute runtime, and filming finally entered proper production. The team involved had a huge passion for tugs, and everyone paid close attention to detail to make sure there were little to no inconsistencies. However, when nearing the end of production, a problem arose. TUGS had gone excessively over budget, resulting in a short hold for filming. Either an executive or Mitton himself decided the idea was to release 2 VHS tapes containing a total of 4 episodes and some merchandise to gain back the money. So, the VHS tapes, Sunshine and Munitions were distributed by Castle Vision to the public to help gain some money to finish the show.
Castle Vision is pleased to announce that it has just successfully concluded negotiations for the acquisition of the video rights to TUGS, a brand new series of children's programs from the producers of Thomas the Tank Engine.
These were released in 1988, a whole year before the show properly aired. These contained the full 20-minute edits and a big banner on the cover saying, "From the producers of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends." Unfortunately, this did not help with aiming the show at an older audience, and probably made sales slightly weaker. However, the sales must have made enough money back as production began properly once again. TUGS finally finished production in December 1988, with all episodes completed. However, the chaos for the show had only just begun. Once TUGS finished production, TVS and ITV noticed a problem. The 20-minute runtime wouldn't work well alongside adverts, leaving a gap in their viewing schedule. Executives decided the episode should be cut down to 15 minutes, much to the crew's frustration. This meant large chunks of some episodes had to be cut out and even some dialogue changed in places. Whilst they already had 20-minute edits of 4 episodes, these also had to be cut down for TV airings. As for the rest of the episodes, it is believed they do have 20-minute cuts, but these have never been released publicly. The episodes were all now edited and assembled for their 15-minute runtime and completed for airing. TUGS finally aired on the 4th of April 1989, with all episodes being released up until the 27th of June that year.
We've also got another brand new programme starting tomorrow afternoon, which is TUGS, as Scally says. Yes, if you enjoy Thomas the Tank Engine, you'll love this.
It also aired in many other countries. However, TUGS didn't quite have the same instant success that Thomas did. David Mitton and Robert Cardona really tried to push with the release of more merchandise, and they also wanted TUGS to reach a larger audience, mainly in the United States, as this was where the show was set. An American test dub of the episode Sunshine was made, and Robert Cardona went to the States to see if he could sell TUGS to a US market. However, nothing came of this, and TUGS never released in North America. Even though things weren't going swimmingly, David Mitton still had big plans for a second season of TUGS, which would take place upriver and leave the focus of Big City Port. However, in 1990 disaster struck when Television South filed for bankruptcy, believed to be due to TUGS' expensive budget. This didn't help Clearwater Features, as they had a stake in TVS. To make matters worse, a gentleman named Desmond Cox claimed Robert Cardona had stolen the idea of TUGS from him and filed a lawsuit. Whilst this didn't go any further than threats, and from what we know the lawsuit didn't go anywhere, it certainly put a large amount of pressure on Clearwater Features, and due to the bankruptcy of TVS on New Year's Eve 1990, Clearwater Features was liquidated and finally shut its doors to the public. TUGS' big ambition had caused David Mitton's company to depart forever. This is where Robert Cardona departed from David Mitton and left for Canada, only to release his own tugboat show called Viador Tugboat a few years later. David Mitton was lost. He now had no show or work. But an old friend came back to his rescue. Britt Allcroft returned back from her venture to the USA with the release of Shining Time, and it had been a great success. Not only had Thomas succeeded in the United States, but he was also popular in Japan and Australia. She wanted to make another series of Thomas with her new company, the Britt Allcroft Company. Britt didn't require funding from Clearwater Features now, due to Thomas's international success. But with Robert Cardona gone, this would be the first series where Britt was the sole producer. The show couldn't change style, and she wanted her old crew back. Britt agreed to hire David Mitton back as director, along with purchasing all the models and assets from TUGS, which was seized under liquidation. It is believed at this time, Britt and David's dispute had been settled, and it was finally time to bring the cheeky blue tank engine back to the screens with a much higher budget than before. But that's another story. Thank you all for watching this long supercut on the history of Clearwater Features. I'd like to thank Brannon Carty and the Star Switcher for helping me fact check this video. I'd also like to thank the TUGS project and UlfsteadEstate for their assets and resources. This video wouldn't have been possible without these guys. I know a lot of you have been asking for Series 3 production history, and I can confirm that it will be releasing sometime this summer. I'm sorry it has taken so long, but it is now in development, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing or even leaving a like and a comment. It really does help the channel. I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I shall see you in the next one.